Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica McDonald. I'm the Nancy Inman and Marlene Nathan Meyerson curator of photography at the Ransom Center. I'm thrilled to welcome my guest, Joanne Leonard, joining us remotely from her home in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Joanne Leonard is a photographer, photo collage artist, teacher, writer, and feminist whose work has contributed to a wide variety of fields, including the study of autobiography. Her work is held in major museums all across the United States and elsewhere, from the Museum of Modern Art to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, from the Minneapolis Institute of Art to the Ransom Center, and most stops in between. In the 1960s and 70s, she taught at the San Francisco Bay Area for about a decade at the San Francisco Art Institute, Mills College, a number of other places, which we'll talk about as we get going. She taught at the University of Michigan for 31 years and now has a title even longer than mine, I think, the Diane M. Kirkpatrick and Griselda Pollock Distinguished University Professor Emerita of the School of Art and Design and Department of Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. Welcome, Joanne.
Thank you.
Lovely to have you. This is one in a series of interviews highlighting recent acquisitions at the Ransom Center, and in particular, acquisitions that represent former gaps in the collection that we've been working to fill. We've invited you here today because you have very generously donated 60 works to the Ransom Center's photography collection, helping us to remedy one of the major gaps in our collection, that of women artists working in the 70s and 80s. And beyond, but that particular era is well represented by your gift. Nearly all of those works were made in the mid to late 1970s, and I'd like to talk with you today about those in some depth. In order to give them context, we'll go back to some of your earlier work. We'll also look at the way motifs in that work continue on to some of your later work. But I would just encourage any viewer to look at your monograph, which is right behind me, Being in Pictures, published in 2008. The full title is Being in Pictures, an Intimate Photo Memoir, because today we won't be able to go in depth about all of the work you've done over half a century, but it's well worth a look at those projects in your wonderful monograph, which is in itself a beautifully constructed, very personal memoir. Okay, so I think what I'd like to do in order to kind of get us up to speed to the works that you've given to us that are now in the collection, I'd like to talk about your earliest involvement with photography. And I'm just gonna give some very skeletal sort of biographical details here. Again, everyone can find more in your monograph, and also we'll link in our event description to your website and other resources. So you were born in Los Angeles, attended the University of California at Berkeley from 1958 to 1962, majored in social science, minored in art, but didn't have the opportunity there to take any formal photography classes. There just weren't any there. From what I gather, you were able to sort of cobble together some evening courses that I'm not sure, maybe I would call sort of continuing ed, offered in evenings through high schools and sort of local community colleges or junior colleges. And somehow, even just by those sort of classes put together, you had a pretty good sense when you graduated that you would somehow work in photography. You, right after graduation, went to be closer to your twin sister in Boston. And the fact that you're an identical twin will be discussed in a lot of your work as we go today. After probably, what was it, a few months there, 6 months, you returned to the Bay Area, lived on Haight Street, and set up an enlarger under a second floor staircase. And one of the earliest photographs you've added to our collection is a photograph you took from the park across from your Haight Street house, divided into apartments, and also this photograph of your room in that house. I'd like to talk about these photographs because this was 1963. And this is where you lived while you were studying with John Collier Jr., who we know as a farm security administration photographer who later developed theories of visual anthropology and was probably working on while you were studying with him, the foundational text, Visual Anthropology, Photography as a Research Method, and that was in 1967. You met sculptor Bruce Beasley in 64, left your Haight Street apartment, moved to Oakland, and the two of you married in 1967. You photographed extensively in West Oakland, people that were your neighbors there, and they were exhibited in your first major one-person exhibition called Our Town, Photographs of Her West Oakland Neighborhood by Joanne Leonard in 1968 at the DeYoung Memorial Museum in San Francisco. So there's a lot to talk about here. I would like to start by asking you about John Collier Jr. and if you were familiar with his approach to photography when you studied with him. Is that the reason did you seek him out, or was that something you weren't aware of and learned about as you took courses with him? Were you aiming to be a documentary photographer in the sort of social science vein? And how studying with him may have affected the way you approached your subjects who were also your friends and neighbors in West Oakland, and how some of those theories of and techniques of photo elicitation and the way he trained people to work with those subjects sort of in not such an objective, more of a relational mode might have played a role in your work there. Maybe we'll start there. That seems to be a lot.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that while I was in school, I went to evening high school and took a class where you just learned how to develop film. But the first serious photo class I took was with Jack Wellpott at San Francisco State, and Judy Dater was in that class as well. While I was there, I read that John Collier Jr. was teaching a class, and my introduction to photography and some of my eventual desire or even early thinking about photography came from the show The Family of Man, and from seeing the exhibit The Bitter Years. I knew the name John Collier Jr. He had been the youngest member of the FSA group of photographers. So I wrote him a note and said, is there any chance that I could be in your class? And he phoned me. His teachings, yes, were very influential. You had a name for it, his process, but I've always said that he considered the photographs one was taking better instruments for the typical anthropologist would go with the questionnaire. Where were you born? What kind of a family structure do you have? Is it a matrilineal, community or and so on? He thought the photographs were projective tools so that you could show the photograph to somebody and say, who are these people? Are you related? And so on, which I thought was brilliant and so useful. So John's, what I learned from John, this idea of showing the page seems kind of obvious, but engaging people and learning about them through the photographs was invaluhelp, especially maybe in West Oakland, when I came to live in West Oakland.
I think that one thing that might help us get back around to this is something you wrote about in your monograph, and you were pretty, I thought, self-reflective about the fact that you were in West Oakland as an artist, living with another artist in sort of an industrial area that was really, I think, on the decline. There were many people living there because it was where they could live based on their socioeconomic status. And you felt that you were there by choice, kind of deciding to live without a lot of material possessions but it was a privilege to be able to make that choice. And that wasn't a privilege shared by many of your neighbors.
Coming to live in West Oakland was kind of a gradual process and not something I did in order to photograph. Yeah, I lived in at first, the building you showed, a tin warehouse. We went and got scrap lumber and heated the place there with the wood stove. It was a dedication to being artists, mainly him. I mean, I didn't need to be there for that, but I was there because of him. And that building is in an industrial, well, now it's torn down because the BART station is just about there, where when you're on the elevated tracks, I could look right down into where. So eventually we moved a few blocks more into residential. Well, no, it really isn't. The very edges of residential, kind of quasi-industrial, because the building was actually an industrial building. It had been a flour mill and it had been the Boy Scout headquarters. It was a big building where my husband had a foundry downstairs, and then we had a living quarters upstairs. And so my first look onto the neighborhood was from the upstairs windows, photographing children playing. And it was through the absorption of what John Collier had taught me that I began to think about going out and showing those pictures to people and asking the parents of the children that or people I assumed were the parents about about themselves and showing them the pictures. I stapled pictures to the big industrial warehouse door, the sliding door, so people could just come and take them, and began conversations about who lived where and things like that. And that's how I started, without a thought of documenting West Oakland in the beginning. And I lived there 8 years. So eventually, because of the rats, because we lived in what was considered or called an unincorporated part of the city. It means it developed before the city became a city with a charter, and there were no curbs and gutters, and you could not have garbage service if you didn't have curbs and gutters. And there were houses there that were built by railroad workers who came during World War II, came to work at Kaiser. And Mr. Piper, who's in many of my photographs, he was an aristocrat of the neighborhood because he was a former Pullman porter. And that's a fairly high position. So the people that lived right around, the ones I could see from walking out of the front door, those were houses that were incredibly substandard, and the whole neighborhood, no street lighting, no curbs and gutters, no garbage pickup. That was 3rd Street and 5th Street where we lived. And then at 11th and 12th Street, the poorest neighborhood in Oakland, and not just because that's where they settled, but because Oakland wouldn't let Black people live just anywhere, and the jazz clubs there couldn't be downtown. So 7th Street was a famous jazz clubs, wonderful neighborhood, really. And Bruce and I got involved in neighborhood efforts, started under the War on Poverty under Johnson, to ask the city to provide curbs and gutters. And they said, well, that's easy. You just have a tax assessment district and you get everybody to sign. And that wasn't easy at all, of course. So we began to learn something about the politics of improving. And through that, we met those 2 women that you see in that photograph with holding up the banner for the jobs for BART, B. Slider and Everly Tyler, B. Slider was the head of the Prescott Neighborhood Council, where you call the photograph the Vietnam soldier ready on leave. That's Barbara Slider and Leo. That was B. Slider's daughter. So I began to know people, to photograph events. We went to Thanksgiving at their house. So those were my friends.
Mhm.
They were just my subjects. And it wasn't a project in a sense. At least the photographs at the family events were as much a gift to them, and because they said I could, and and so on. Then the documentary perspective that you might have imagined.
You kept photographing in that neighborhood. And some of the photographs you made in West Oakland were also shown in a number of other exhibitions across the country. So two of them were in Vision and Expression at the George Eastman House in Rochester, in an exhibition organized by Nathan Lyons, in which a lot of names we would recognize were participants. Also California Photographers, 1970, organized by Fred Parker at the Pasadena Art Museum. I think it was just as he was transitioning from UC Davis to Pasadena, and that traveled to the Oakland Museum as well. That was a pretty groundbreaking show. And around this time, so kind of around 69 to 71, let's say, you'd also photographed your own friends and family extensively. And you came to realize that your practice could incorporate both sort of public and private, and there wasn't that distinct of a separation between those two. I want to show our viewers some photographs that I think you made at this time, where we're seeing family photographs next to West Oakland photographs, and we're seeing them in the book Woman by Three, which is a book that was not so much an artist book as a book edited and using your photographs.
Part of my bent toward intimacy was that I was a pretty timid documentarian. I didn't really like going outside of I only really became comfortable with my documentary interest in the neighborhood when I could say, actually, it's kind of like the pictures I take of my sister's children and our own weddings in the family and so on, to kind of marry the two and say they were the same, which as I got to know people, it became more a possibility and the truth. And so I was trying to define against both this let's get a book together about pretty pictures of women and what they do, and to glorify my own everydayness, the everydayness that I liked in photographs, and I wanted the photographs to appear as mostly they were, to be of people who were comfortable with my being there and were not so aware of the camera, not posing for the camera and so on, to have that aspect to them, that they were true in some way, and not of my construction. And so I was just finding my way, trying to be, I always said I was the Mary Cassatt of photography, that I wanted to be just photograph. She painted her sister and her sister's children. And when I started in photography, I didn't have children of my own, but my sister and her family, and those things would never get into a museum. So the miracle was that they began to, in the exhibition you mentioned, the Vision and Expression, had my 2-year-old nephew and a West Oakland photograph. So we began to be able to make the photographs using the sort of standards of art photography, or whatever you might say, kind of did it for them, make my family photographs important. And that's what I wanted to do, was, and that's, I guess we'll talk eventually about feminism, but that was my own brand of feminism, that to make subjects that were everyday life of women, for example, a subject of some importance, where it could even be exhibited and not be dismissed as nothing of any interest.
I'd like to keep talking a little bit about this sort of moment when you're determining not only this kind of mode of practice, but also some of the motifs that inevitably bubbled up in this book we just looked at. So nearly half of the photographs in that book, and now this may be partially because of the editorial process and the kinds of photographs that were that editor was looking for, so we can't 100% attribute the selection to you, but it is true that this editor was able to accumulate about half of those photographs were of pregnant women or women with young children, and these motifs of parenthood and pregnancy and fertility go through a great deal of your work, perhaps all of it. And this is also true of some of the publications that were kind of also other popular publications. So around this time, there were invitational exhibitions and also a lot of kind of photo contests. Life would invite photographers from around the country to submit work. And in 1970, a photograph, again, of your brother-in-law, your sister-in-law, and their son appeared in an issue of Life that was a photo contest issue. Again, that idea, those universals of motherhood and those sort of pictures of family were something sought by these kinds of contests and pictures, but also became really meaningful in your work. And again, this idea that some of those pictures of your family were able to make it into the museum world and publications, especially one of those really important early pictures for you was that picture of your sister-in-law, Sonia, in 1966, photographed there, hanging laundry. Her nightgown is sort of backlit to outline her pregnant belly. There's a lot of idealism in those works. And you've written elsewhere, and I can't encourage enough our viewers to read your monograph/memoir, which is just really wonderful. But you've written so openly about the ideas you had about what marriage would mean, and how a lot of those ideas were really turned upside down when your marriage ended, and your work dramatically changed as well. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the start of this series, which is the Dreams and Nightmares series. This is really a turning point. It's the dissolution of these romantic ideals, and it's a change.
So let me jump back just a moment to something you would ask before, because it'll lead us here. I want to acknowledge the kind of privilege that you were suggesting. You say your work was shown here and there and all. I had a certain wherewithal. I was articulate. I was not afraid to go and talk to people. I had the privilege of a white upper middle class. We were really more middle class, but my mother's background, upper middle class, highly intellectual. My father's, anyway, I had a lot of privilege in being articulate, unafraid, and things like that, that allowed me to go places, to approach people, to send my work to competitions and so on, and succeed. And being married, I even had time. Even though I was working, I still had more support, and I could spend my money on my work. I had a marriage that wasn't a really good marriage, and I operated in a realm that was set up in a very selfish way. He believed, he would articulate, there's squaws work and braves work, and he wanted me to cook. I was given the Julia Child cookbook and learned how to make beef stroganoff and stuff. The most foreign thing in the world to me, cooking and domestic life. But that was his idea of what a wife would do. And so I'm kind of lucky ultimately that he fell in love with somebody. I desperately wanted children. You can see that in the photographs. All of that was partly what you say, idealizing a woman's body and idealizing a woman's life, but many things that I didn't have really, or didn't see myself getting to. And then the marriage, in which I invested a lot of romantic ideas. I mean, I wasn't altogether admitting I didn't have that. I was investing in the notion of this is the great love of my life, fell apart. And then I made that collage, romanticism is ultimately fatal, that is on the cover of the monograph. And the series, the Dreams and Nightmares series, about the longings and and disillusionments.
You've written, I felt I made this work and titled it Romanticism is Ultimately Fatal in order to purge sorrow over love lost. Later, the women's movement helped me and other women understand one of the work's larger themes, that romance is a powerful cover, often masking the very bad deal marriage can sometimes be, especially for women. In what I've just read, you stated that the women's movement helped you and other women understand that marriage could be a bad deal. And I'm really interested in how the women's movement helped. It seems that around this time, you become more actively engaged in the women's movement, sort of more overtly. And perhaps that's just what's because of what's visible to me. Maybe you were already quite engaged before. You can clarify that. But also it seems that your work was really embraced by publications like Ms. and like Heresies. It was included in Lucy Lepard's very early important book from the center. It was a reciprocal relationship. You felt very supported and acknowledged by that community and part of it, and your work became engaged as well.
Well, the consciousness about what a bad deal a marriage could be. I mean, my marriage was very hard on me in the end. I mean, at least the end of it showed what, how the distance between some imagined great romance that lasted for years, which my twin sister has had just a wonderful, very early marriage. She married before she finished college and is still married and has 6 grandchildren and a wonderful, wonderful husband. But I made bad decisions. I was dazzled by glamour and entry into the realm of art where I wanted to be. He was a young sculptor at Berkeley who his work had been purchased by the Museum of Modern Art in Paris, the second American ever to be, and so on and so on. So I was dazzled. I wanted to be in this world, but otherwise the marriage, when he left, leaving me practically nothing. He was the son of a banker and he came from a very wealthy family. And so it isn't surprising that when I began to read some literature about marriage and its relationship to capitalism and exploitation and labor, divisions of labor and so on, that theory. But other ways the women's movement, besides the literature, was the opportunities. You mentioned the book, after The Family of Man, it even became commercially maybe viable, that The Family of Women, The Family of Children, but there was also Women See Women and Women See Men, and books put together by collectives. And then there was Heresies, the publication, which when I was looking back through it to find things for our conversations, I'm just dazzled by the importance of the Nancy Spiro and Adrienne Rich and the level of art and the level of people that I came later to admire that were engaged in this. And so when I showed my, we haven't gotten to talking about the journal, but anyway, some of the work I eventually did was quickly embraced. There was a place for it. So really that preceded my awareness. There were people making things happen and doing things and creating theory and literature before I was ready for it. I was in this horrible marriage, investing in being somebody that I turned out not to be. But it was there when I in the beginning of the 70s when I needed it, and it was wonderful and wonderfully helpful professionally.
I'm glad you mentioned the journal. We'll get to that in just a moment, but I'd like to talk about another project, maybe a subset of work you had been working on at the same time as you're making these collages, which look very different from the earlier work. You're also making a group of photographs called Two Women Who Live Alone. And this is sort of between 1971 and 1973. And the reason I wanted to talk about these is because many of them are very lovely photographs, but also because I thought it was both, I was struck by a comment while we were just talking about Lucy Lepard. She, in an essay she wrote about your work in 1980, so not, less than a decade after you were making this work, she referred to the Dreams and Nightmares series that we just talked about, that we're sort of working through the loss of your marriage. And she says about you that you awakened from the Dreams and Nightmares series in 1972 and turned, understandably, to the subject, Homes of Two Women Who Live Alone. And I'm wondering if you were consciously working in that direction, to sort of explore what it meant to be a woman who lived alone. And if not, what did motivate you to start that project? Do you think Lucy Lepard had something there now that you reflect on it? And did you seek out those subjects, or do you sort of understand it differently retroactively?
Lucy probably had something there. And the title came later, I think. I made the photographs and then put them together in that way. But even if I wanted to, I probably couldn't deny it. Being the daughter of a psychoanalyst, my mother, in my growing up, one could really almost never deny some underlying motivation that one didn't know about. So because Freud said so, so that certainly Freudian ideas would suggest that even if I said, oh no, that was the farthest thing from my mind, would be the reaction, and you could be led to understand more about yourself by thinking about these possibly unconscious motives. So let's say yes, but also talk about what I thought I was doing. So I thought I was saying goodbye to West Oakland in a way that Bruce and I were separating, and Corinne lived across the street next to Mr. Piper. And I asked if I could come inside and photograph her house and her in her home. And some of those photographs are from that household. And then I guess I saw an opportunity to expand that kind of perspective inside a woman's home in the very interesting home of my eventual new boyfriend, Manuel Neri. So his mother lived in San Leandro. She is a Mexican woman, and it's her kitchen window and some of the other interiors that you have there that are in her house. So this work preceded the work I did immediately afterwards of many home interiors of kitchens, but was also the beginning of that. But it seemed different and slightly differently motivated, and maybe underlying it was looking at the lives of women who lived alone, but I didn't know that yet. And maybe I did more consciously know it by the time I named it. But actually, no, not even when Lucy wrote that, but when you asked me, that's when I started having to think about, oh, maybe that was true. I don't know, probably.
So you just mentioned that you thought of this work as transitional, leaving West Oakland, moving on. And this also is a point at which, and I'll let you explain this in the way that you'd like to, but I sense a real kind of reevaluation of this is a moment for you to take stock, you to decide what you'd like to do in your life. If that means having a child, then you'll have a child, and it won't be dependent on a partner who may or may not wish to have a child. And in 1973, you did become pregnant and were thrilled and began a collage journal. We can talk about the collage elements there, but I just want to show 3 images from that journal. It starts out joyous. Here's a pear standing in for a pregnant woman, as you write, fairly jumping for joy. But this journal, which is ultimately called Journal of a Miscarriage, quickly turns devastating. This is rupture, because very shortly after you began the journal, you experienced a miscarriage. And this particular image joins images from a gynecological text with your own blood. That's kind of the arc of this journal. Starts with great joy, then we've got great tragedy and trying to figure out sort of where to go from there, how to address yet another major loss. And then to speed through what ended up being 30 images, there are some more hopeful ones toward the end. This is reproduction with a sort of photography pun here with the child and the developer, called reproduction, photographic reproduction, human reproduction. But it gets a little bit lighter, a little bit more hopeful toward the future. And I guess I would just like to invite you to tell the story how you would tell it, about how this journal came to be. But then let's talk about some of the implications of doing this highly personal work that was not readily seen at the time, in an era where women hadn't even yet appeared in most art history books, much less really personal work of this sort.
Okay, well, at the beginning of this starts back in my past of unevolved feminist, where I'm in the Bay Area and I'm surrounded by artists. I'm the photographer, kind of not even really, qualified as an artist, and sculptors and painters and so on. And one thing I found very enviable was the notion of a sketchbook, which Manuel had lots of sketchbooks and he did wonderful drawings. So I bought a sketchbook of the same kind, hard black covers, about 11 by, I don't know, 8.5 by 11 or so. And I was pregnant. So I started with this really happy image. One of my other goals was the Dreams and Nightmares series was very darkroom evolved. It involved figuring out how to print on transparent material and layer collage behind it. I envied the really spontaneous kind of collage work of people like, and use of grommets in the corners of canvases like William Wiley. And so I had this arts around that related to materials and things that were not really my materials, and I wanted to try. So that was, one way, the beginning of it. But then I almost immediately had a miscarriage. So then I was on my own, and there was nothing I'd ever seen what to do. And before going to the hospital for the aftermath of the miscarriage, I actually put blood on pages and then came back, and it kept me going. I was going, a friend who was a doctor gave me this obstetrical textbook, and I was going to use bookstores to find old magazines that I could tear up and things like that to make the collages. So at the same time that I was devastated, partly because I was so ambivalent in the beginning. I was terrified I was going to have a baby on my own. How could I manage? Then I blamed myself. If you'd only known how much you wanted this, of course you wanted this. And now look what's happened. And I was so miserable. So this process of putting it on paper was very, very helpful and very productive. And over 30 days. I was very productive, so it was a great thing. And then I was already scheduled for an exhibit at the Art Institute in San Francisco in the very big Diego Rivera Gallery. And this work from the beginning was considered problematic. So Phil Linares, who was an artist himself, but the director at that time of the gallery, constructed kind of a room within the room where the doorway, you had to walk past one wall in like that. So you would not be seen while you were in the room, that you could feel somewhat private and not too many people wouldn't inadvertently just stumble upon this and go, oh my God, or something, that you'd have to really intentionally confront it. So there was all this framing that my friend, my colleagues who work on censorship and stuff would say, a combination of institutional censorship and self-censorship and not completely censored, but anyway, a great deal of carefulness and consideration went into it. So that was the story of exhibiting it in the beginning.
In a series of interviews we're doing about gaps in collections, I mean, I think it's important to talk about the experience of pitching, for lack of a better word, this kind of work to curators in the 70s.
It is a pretty, it's always a hard thing to do, to pitch your own work, but that's the position I've always been in. So when it wasn't hard for me to be in the East Coast because my parents by then lived on the East Coast. And so I would regularly go into New York. So with the kind of temerity that I've described, I am able to put myself, I've got in touch with the museum, made an appointment. I had an appointment with John Sarkowski, went to the Museum of Modern Art with this material. And I think this may also set up a little bit of coastal difference, that because of Miriam Shapiro, because of West Coast feminism, Judy Chicago, and so on, that there was an atmosphere there when they said, take it to New York. Maybe they didn't know what they were talking about, because New York maybe wasn't nearly as ready. But certainly there was no consciousness we should be looking for work by women or about women's experience. No. Although, I mean, you could say that Nancy Spiro and, those, there were things being shown. I can't say nothing, but not in a context that was made of a space or a road for this work. So I took it, the appointment. John Sarkowski was late. His associate, it turns out I just looked up what this person actually was at the museum, who looked at it first, was an intern in photography. But he said, well, can I look at it? So he, I'm here to tell you that John Sarkowski is going to be a little late, but I'd be happy to look at it. So he started to look at it and he was appalled. And he put it back together, and I had taken the pages out of the book that they were created in, out of the sketchbook, and put each, for the exhibit at the Art Institute, put them on a backing of larger paper. So he was looking at a box that had these pages, loose pages, put them back in the box and closed the box. And so of course I was very uncomfortable by the time John Sarkowski arrived, and he looked through the work with great evenness and just plodded through it while I felt very uncomfortable. Then closed the box and said, well, I think this is about something we all know about, don't we? And that was the end of the conversation. So I realized this is not the kind of work in this moment. I mean, I don't think I even had the mental set to say in this moment. This is not the kind of work you go around presenting yourself. If someone is going to see this again, it's not going to be because I'm showing it to them. And maybe someone else will show it to them, but I'm just putting this work away. Mm-hmm. So that's what happened until years later.
I mentioned earlier that the last part of that journal takes a more hopeful outlook, or you can kind of read that. And I feel it's most appropriate for me to let you talk about this diptych that you gave to us, which I love very much, and how it might represent sort of a more optimistic time following the production of that journal.
So we're talking about a photograph of a chandelier on the ceiling and another view of the same room where looking toward a mirror on a dresser at the end of the bed. So a view of the bed in a hotel room. And at the same time, you know that I've written that that's the place and the moment, more or less, of where my daughter was conceived. I guess, an ironic, or I mean, it's not that romantic to think of this not terribly fancy hotel room as the place, but Manuel taught at Davis, which is over an hour from the Bay Area where I taught. So we didn't live in the same place because we had work in different cities. And so this was our being together on vacation. So it was very wonderful, even though the photographs don't, black and white photographs of a chandelier and a mirror in a hotel room don't maybe.
And feet, don't forget the feet.
And feet, yes, there's a lot of intimacy in there that we're kind of in there in those pictures, but that's the story behind it. That's our being together when we normally were not, and being sleeping together, and so I'm very fond of those pictures too, and I'm glad that you have them.
Well, and it's another sort of transitional photograph for me, because then we get Julia appearing, your daughter, appearing in 1975. And we could do a whole other program, I think, on all the photographs you've made of her alone or collaged with other generations of women in your family. And I will spare her that at the moment. I'm sure she'll appreciate that. But it does help us kind of segue into the bulk of the work that you've given us, which deals with home interiors. And that's a big topic, and it involves a number of different motivations and subsets. But I just want to look at a couple of examples until we get into that body. I want to look at very quickly a couple of photographs you made shortly after Julia was born that I think address the realities of being a mother, a working mother, a single working mother, and an artist, and how that all kind of converges to necessarily influence the work you make. You make the work that you can make. Often. And so there's this pair, and we have to notice the kind of twinning of this double work. And at one point, at least in some venues, this was called part of a double view series. And this is where you sort of came home exhausted. Your living room, which functioned, had a variety of functions, was a mess, as happens when you have a young child, an infant, toddler. And then you were inspired by watching a documentary on Eleanor Roosevelt to tidy it up and rephotograph it. And so we have this sort of before and after, but the circumstances of that rely on these conditions of you being a single mother who had just put in probably a 12-hour day and came home. And what work can you make but that which is inspired by these circumstances, really? And then we also have some more photographs of your own home. This really beautiful photograph of your bedroom in the flat that you had when your daughter was born. Here it is as your bedroom, and here then it sort of transitions into her room. Again, kind of this transitional period. You start photographing interiors of your neighbors' homes. I just love this one in the painter of David Lemon and his wife Frankie Lemon. Here's an interior in which a chair and a painting of that chair are on the same wall there. And your own house after Josephine Street, you moved into a little house on Blake Street. Here's a really beautiful sort of formalist view of this old stove. And this became part of a project that I think makes up the bulk of the work we now have here at the Ransom Center, and that I'm so delighted that we have. And that project was called, and I'll have to explain why I'm calling it this, but the impact of technology. And there are some other titles, but essentially, there was a proposal made driven by Chauncey Hare, another photographer, and I'd like to ask you a few questions about sort of his goals for the project, to photograph the impact of technology on humans. And I think where he was coming from was work he had done in corporate America. He had been a Standard Oil employee, and he was really looking at the negative impact of technology on workers and on people working in corporations, and how it all kind of combined to be really a dehumanizing experience. And he led this proposal for you, Bill Owens, and another photographer with whom he'd worked at Standard Oil, Don Thompson, to get together and make a project about the impact of technology on. And for you, it turned out to be on women, but everyone kind of had their slice. And that was a proposal that was granted in 1977 by the National Endowment for the Arts. And you began photographing in earnest. You were looking at home technology, so appliances. And a lot of these appliances at this time, 1977, 78, 79, were new. So automatic dishwashers, microwaves. There were all these different kinds of coffee makers on the market that could make the coffee for you, automatic drip machines, electric can openers, all these things that had been manual, electric mixers, things that had been typically manual, were perhaps intended to improve the lives of women, save them time.
The selling points certainly were, that don't be a dishwasher, buy one.
Yeah.
And dishwasher, that was the slogan. I mean, we could probably examine how much the electrical, like Pacific Gas and Electric or Detroit Edison, how much they were behind all this electrification in the home, and how it could be used and maximize the use of electrical power and so on. That might have been even behind it. But I think after World War II, when women had been employed outside the home, and there was a great aspect of life in the early 50s of trying to return women to home and domesticity, and don't deprive a man of a job, stay home, and so on. But it didn't really work, and women were working, and also life somehow is exceeding the expenses of living, exceeded the income of many partners, male partners. And so these households began to be two working parents. And so these were time savers to some extent. But how much time are you saving when you open your can with an electric can opener instead of grinding? I really can't say. But anyway, they were there, people bought them. I met with groups of women photographers who were interested in my work in the Bay Area, some of whom were groups of older women who said, well, home technology, you don't need appliances. To us, running water is home technology. I mean, we didn't have running water when I was growing up, one woman said. And so my definition of home technology were these and I guess I should back up. Chauncey had these grand ideas, and he got us this grant, and I think he saw the importance of having a woman's perspective. But I had a 2-year-old, and I had to figure out what I could do that I couldn't do a full-blown documentary project, and it required me to follow up and go many places. I did it mostly on my own block, and in my own neighborhood, and a little bit outside of that. But that was I tried to do with concentration and depth what I couldn't do with breadth and generality. So it's a small slice of the world, and then it transported from Berkeley Arena to Ann Arbor.
Right.
So there's a bit of Midwestern aspect.
Right. Well, and I want to look at some others you took while you were still in the Bay Area. I think some that are really interesting in particular. I mean, the entire series is very interesting, and it's a really important, I think, snapshot of a time, giving us a sense of sort of women in the home. I could say a lot more of that. That's a very sort of abbreviated and obvious thing to say, but a sort of subset of these pictures that I hadn't considered as much is these photographs of children's spaces, and how there are children's versions of appliances that are sort of seemingly perhaps, I mean, it could very well be that children want to play at doing what they see their parents doing, but it also seems a little bit like kind of training them to fill that heteronormative kind of domestic role of the woman. So you have a toy coffee maker, a toy broom, a toy refrigerator, a toy stove, a toy, ironing board as a little girl. And these were marketed to parents of little girls. And this is what they would sort of play during daycare, or, and there was a sort of at Mills College, you photographed these at Mills College, where these rooms were sort of set up for children to play. Was that a daycare, or was that
a daycare center? Yeah.
And so we have, a product actually called, Lady Coffee. We have a toy telephone, right. We have radios, we have kitchen appliances. And there's this sort of housework as play, as training to kind of perform these functions, and establish that as sort of the norm. These are just really interesting photographs to see from the late 70s. And
so I think women's magazines played a big part in that, and showing Ladies' Home Journal and things like that were part of the re-domestication of women in 50s and up to the 60s and the women's movement, to return women to the home. And you're right, and the early education part is part of that.
Right. Another aspect of this that it comes through loud and clear in the group of photographs that you've given to us is this idea of the telephone as a sort of control center of the home, often in the kitchen, often the kind of woman's domain. And then to elaborate that further, a subseries of memo centers, which often center around a telephone, but then are surrounded by calendars and notes and bulletin boards and all of the kind of schedules of everybody in the household, and all of the things to remember, the to-do lists, everything that needs to be remembered and noted and in order to sort of command the household operation. And you've made analogies, which I think this is a really smart analogy, and I'm interested in, I don't know if you can remember how it came to you, but this analogy in looking at Chauncey Hare's photographs, where he photographed and thought a lot about the sort of command centers in big, not just corporate settings where you would have rooms with kind of electronics, but also in industry where you would have command centers over these big spaces and lots of workers, and how this was the communication system inside and to the outside world. And at home, the command center was run by the woman. And this is where it was. And the center of it was a telephone. And could you just talk more about, I know it's always difficult to ask an artist, how did you get that idea? And I know that's an impossible question, but the development of this and how you sort of decided to put this together as a sub-series in relation to this larger project, which was, I think, coming from a place of kind of the dehumanizing forces of these command centers. But here, these are not dehumanizing. I don't think it looks at it in a very different way.
Well, I'm not sure that I know. I mean, I was photographing as many rooms and spaces as people would let me, and the telephone might have been more prominent when I first, okay, I have to photograph a phone, but noticing the surround was the memo board and the phone numbers, it's a dentist and the cleaners and things like that. I also saw it as a place where it turned out, as the photographs accumulated, some aspect of fantasy that went beyond the house, the butterflies, the bee, the things on the wall surrounding the phone were not just practical, like memos about what to do, but also were art on calendars and things like that. A little way in which the women were inhabiting their space with an aesthetic of their own. So that interested me. I had become very interested in questions of text and image. And so there was a narrative aspect of this text could be read to tell more about the women's lives. So all of that interested me. And then there was the reach to try to parallel something that Chauncey was doing, that and originally a show was anticipated, and I thought there should be threads, and I was self-conscious about that there would be, ways to group his work and my work along certain themes that might also work. So all of those things probably came to bring me to, but my own house had that too. So, went from my stove to
every house had that, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I have a similar, maybe I traveled in similar circles as you, and maybe that's a limited part of the country, but certainly the homes I was in as a kid, in other kids' homes and in my relatives' homes and my grandmother's home, and there was always that place where you went to find the phone numbers and the calendar and everything else.
So just to add one thing, the appliances like the dishwashers, I think actually existed from the 50s and were maybe initially trying to amplify the woman's place in the home rather than to send her out or make it more convenient so she could do double duty. I think it, evolved into the second theme that we elaborated, but initially, well, okay, they can stay home and we'll make it more fun or more, more easy.
Yeah.
They'll have more time with the kids if they get the dishes done faster and things like that.
Right. Well, and I want to talk quickly about televisions as well, because you compared them in 1979 almost to robots, and they have these different sort of roles. And so one sort of subcategory of that is television as babysitter, as childcare, and there are photographs of children asleep on beds or in cribs, either watching or being lulled to sleep by the sound of televisions. One of those appeared in Heresies in 1981. Here, this photograph of a child in a playpen in front of a large kind of console TV, which may have stopped working, and then another TV was sort of on top of that, using the console TV as sort of the furniture on which the other television would. It seems as though it's a soap opera, daytime drama of some sort that is keeping the child company at this moment, at least. That was part of an essay by Lucy Lepard called Home Economics in an issue of Heresies. There you call it television/daycare, and say that it's from the impact of technology on the lives of women series, a study of, quote, a woman's place and the machines and gadgets that inhabit it. There's also something that I sort of intuitively found, just like I remember the memo centers in everyone's home when I was younger, I also remember this idea of the television as companion, the little TV in the kitchen that often women would have on while they were sort of doing their housework. And I guess that's what daytime TV was sort of made for. I mean, it was marketed to women with so-called women's stories, and the ads would sell cleaning products and things, but having a television in the kitchen seemed to be sort of part of all of that. Okay. Now you continue, you've mentioned this, that you continued photographing after you moved to Ann Arbor. In 1978, you moved to Ann Arbor, you traded a a ridiculous number of adjunct positions that you were doing at the same time for one tenure track teaching job, which I think makes sense to everyone listening. And so went to teach at the University of Michigan and continued photographing, even though the project with Chauncey Herron, with Bill Owens, that was sort of proposed for an exhibition in San Francisco. It had sort of dissolved because an agreement about how much text to go, Chauncey Herron really felt it was important to include in the exhibition. There were just sort of a lot of things that couldn't really be resolved. And so that exhibition sort of fell apart, but you continued based on your own interest under the kind of construct of the project, because it was really productive for you. I imagine it may have been a nice way to kind of get into neighbors' homes, possibly, or some kind of way to kind of, have a reason to spend some time there. You kept making these and you wrote about them in 1979. You showed a lot of them in your exhibition here in Austin. And I don't know if I've been clear earlier in our interview, but I'm talking about an exhibition in 1980 at the Laguna Gloria Art Center here. The little catalog is this one with the blue picture on the cover. And Lucy Lepard wrote an introduction there, and it was really kind of a 10-year survey of your work. And it was the sort of way that happened is that somebody here saw your work at Stanford, I think you said, is that right? And was involved with a photography group here and sort of kept in touch with you and sort of made that happen and brought an exhibition here. And it the catalog indicates to me that it was a pretty rich and full show, showing a lot of different work from all of your various series. And it's the first time I was able to trace an exhibition of some of this work intended for that NEA project, and with some critical writing around it, thanks to our friend Lucy Lepard. But one thing that struck me is that even though it was shown a little bit then, you've said that this work has sort of largely been, under the bed, as photographers like to say, since then, for almost 50 years, whereas, works by Chauncey Herron from that time have entered major museum collections. Certainly works by Bill Owens, are well known from around that time and from that project, certainly. Yet your work is only entering collections now, for the most part, from this project. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Again, this is a series of talks with artists whose work we're collecting now because we didn't collect them then. And I think there's a lot of reasons to talk about for that. But I'm wondering if you could reflect on that idea that, you were working alongside as an equal partner in this project, yet your work, it seemed difficult for you to kind of find a home for it after that, or find interest in it, I guess. I'm not really sure what the correct, because that's not all necessarily true. Surely it was interesting and important, but were there institutions who were receptive to it in the way they were receptive to interiors by your kind of photographic partners in that project, who were men and had different kinds of backgrounds and track records? I'm wondering just how you might reflect on that.
Certainly that show at the Laguna Gloria was marvelous in a lot of ways, and they accepted a lot of my ideas, what should be in the exhibit. The memo centers were a part of that exhibit, and the museum here at University of Michigan took that show from Austin and brought it to the University of Michigan Museum, which probably never would have picked that particular group of work. But they took the lead from that. They accepted the show, and it worked to the advantage of both museums because it covered the transportation of instead of sending the work back, the U of M Art Museum transported it back to Michigan. So that worked out, I think, well, and maybe it got a toe in the door for work that would not have been chosen. Since then, the U of M has acquired, but only pretty recently in the 2000s, has there been a photo curator there. So it was Prince Drawings and Photography, and not that actively involved with photography. The space was a hallway and things like that. So it's evolved. But part of the problem was even me not being sure that the photographs were interesting. And I think in truth, they've become more interesting. To me, um, they seem to be better photographs now than I knew. But at the same time, there's an interest in gelatin silver prints, which is the fancy word for black and white photographs. And so they've also capitalized on this moment of retrospection where the 60s and 70s have become maybe the new 30s, where the work from the 30s was very interesting to the 50s curators and museums in the 50s and 60s, and now in the 2000s, the 60s and 70s seem cool. Do you agree with me that that could be another aspect of the
Maybe, but I wonder if, well, I don't see let me restate that. I see a lot of work from the 60s, 70s, 80s in major museum collections that has been there since the 60s and 70s.
Right. So men's work.
So that can't be in full, at least.
That's a really good point. And
including the work of Chauncey Hare and Bill Owens.
Right, for 40 and 50 years. That's true. Well, the subject matter, defining women's spaces, that certainly was, and but compounding it, a work by a woman who's nobody's rushing around trying to find out what I did back then. And then at the same time, should they have asked, they might go, and what else? Because even the West Oakland work seemed more interesting to name a problem of poverty and discrimination. Whereas what is the reason that you think these pictures of a woman's space are interesting? That might have been the question at an earlier moment. So I think perhaps the moment is more here for an interest in spaces that were particularly the spaces women used and wanted to get out of, or were happy to be in. I mean, depending on the women, a happy space. So there are kitchens that aren't represented there that where food, nuttiness around food, not my investment, but Epicurean magazines and gourmet magazines and real farm to table and back to all of this kind of thing now of elaborating for maybe more middle class and well-to-do women, but also serve women in general and the whole realm of and I guess I'm thinking mostly of the kitchens. There aren't just kitchens, of the televisions and so on. It's a different story, but I don't know, a combination of thrifting, looking at cool old stuff, and at the same time, women's spaces. And is this making sense?
Yes, and I think, and this is something that is a very complex conversation, and one that maybe we'll have with the other artists that we include in this interview series at the end. But I think all of the reasons for collecting it now sort of require us to ask why it wasn't collected then. And I think you've made some important points, I think, about the subject matter, and we also need to think about who's doing the collecting. And I think you've talked about some encounters you had with showing your work to curators.
Whether or not a woman photographer wants to be identified with women identified subject matter is another problem. Right. And you have some of the work where I elaborated these photographs with sort of fantasies of my own, made it snow on the countertop.
Yes, let's look at those, shall we?
Sure, because that, while that was sometimes characterized by people criticizing or even embracing the work, thinking of it as a woman trapped in the kitchen wanting to get out. To me, it was as much the opposite, being so much in the work world and so having such difficulty in finding time to be with my daughter and so on because of work and other professional interests. A tension between domesticity and, you asked about inside and beyond, the
Yeah,
tension between these realms of work and home.
right. Well, and Inside and Beyond is the title of that exhibition at the Laguna Gloria that occurred here in Austin in 1980. And here's the cover of that. It's also sitting behind me, but I'll show an image of it. And on the cover is one of those. This series has had a few different titles, I think, over the years, but here I'll refer to what's on the cover here. It's just loosely part of the dream kitchens. There are subsets. There are the skylines and the countertops. Here's a really beautiful one with a blender and a can opener on a countertop with this sort of starry sky, hand colored in with various water soluble crayon and oil and other things. So it joins these documentary photographs you've made of kitchens, which are very almost clinical in their documentation of what's on the counter. And they're often very frontal with this sort of fantasy in the background. And then this is a photograph that is not yet colored or manipulated in any way. This is just a gelatin silver print that you've given us, but it forms the basis of the countertop landscapes and skylines that we're gonna show you here. So this is a photograph you made after moving to Michigan. It started out as a way to kind of deal with the snow that everybody was asking you about. How do you like the snow coming from California? So here's a snowy one. This is not in our collection, but then there are all of these wonderful variants that come along, like countertop springtime, which is what is behind me and shown here. Here's another kind of a sketch. This isn't a finished work. You've identified this as a sketch. And it is inscribed on the front, skyline, different time of day. So I'm not sure if this is it's got a moon and maybe a sunset. This is countertop industry. So we've got kind of a city skyline with some smokestacks there. And you've already answered part of what I was going to talk about with you, that there's this inside outside. It could easily be interpreted, and you've said this is how they were often interpreted, that you're sort of in the kitchen, but that you're imagining the world outside, either a starry night, even industry could be appealing if you're stuck in the kitchen. Springtime, different seasons, different fantasy views of what it would be like outside. If only you could escape the prison of the kitchen. That's kind of the cynical reaction, but not so cynical when you think of how these ideas were being discussed in earnest at a time after many decades of sort of not discussing them in the 1970s. And so we're very delighted to have a nice set of these. I'm really thrilled, and I'm really thrilled to have especially the gelatin silver photograph that is the launching point for these fantasy views. And to talk about the last item that's in our collection before we kind of wrap up with what you've been doing lately, there's one more photograph that is also linked, and this is one that you sent us because you understood that this was later but fundamentally connected, and even though it wasn't part of the first kind of grouping, we had determined that you wanted us to have this, and I'm really grateful that you did, because we knew we would be getting this gelatin silver print, and I believe this is at your parents' house. There's this Corningware coffee maker on the counter. I might have the location wrong, but there are different can openers. There's a coffee maker, looks like a radio, I think. And then that coffee maker appears in this image, which you've called Small Houses and Distant Stars / Hannah Senish. And that coffee maker is in this little house with a path leading to other little houses under the stars. And you should tell us about this.
Well, there is a story behind it. I learned about a resistance worker, a Hungarian woman who spent some time in Palestine and then went to Hungary and to rescue people, including her mother, and died in prison there. And there's quite a bit to read about Hannah Senish if you look her up on online. But when I heard about her, I read something that she wrote before she took on her courageous mission and allowed herself to be parachuted into Hungary. She had been living in Palestine and imagining how she could take a really a role in something bigger than herself and in something that gave her a sense of mission. And she described herself walking under the stars in a place where she could see little houses in the distance, and she thought of herself as between a desire to go in these houses and be comfortable and have a life of more ordinary comfort, and one of belonging to the greater universe and the stars and the moon and so on. So this was the image I made to try to suggest the road, the house, the little houses, the larger universe, and the cozy house into which you could look and see ordinary things that represented ordinary, a good ordinary life, ordinary in a good sense.
So this coffee pot here is representing that.
And that is my parents' coffee pot. The two that you have here that are versions of pieces that have a picture of my daughter in the center, and that I called Julia and the Window of Vulnerability, represent my daughter surrounded by the larger world, a little bit like this Hannah Senish, that there's a bigger world, a dangerous world out there. One has a rocket and represents the danger of nuclear weapons. And the title actually comes from something Ronald Reagan said, that they were building and stockpiling MX missiles to deal with the window of vulnerability, which seemed very poetic. And at the same time, it was a rationale for building hundreds of nuclear weapons that could blow the world up hundreds of times over, which was insanity. Yeah. So the substance of the work, or the impetus for the work, was to suggest how vulnerable I felt as a mother of a small child, how protective. And so it's a combination of a representation of this sense of vulnerability and the house as a symbol of protection for my daughter. So that maybe that covers it. And thrillingly to me, it was included in Gardner's Art Through the Ages, which is the book that you have there, as the frontispiece for the entire section on the modern world. Then this next one is part of a series that I did attempting to represent the absence of my mother, who is suffering from loss of memory. So there's three figures: my daughter on the left, my twin sister standing in for the two of us, she and I, and then my grandmother that my sister resembles quite a bit. And the space between my daughter and my sister should be where my mother would be, but instead there's a section of text pointing to it saying my mother is absent, in the most profound sense, since she's not, she's living but has no memory. And the other text, my daughter said something, my sister wrote on it. So they represent the voices of the women. And I felt that I was giving voice to women who often, when they're photographed, are being silenced. And there's text also drawn from the hearings of the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings where the subject of we don't believe her and she shouldn't be speaking and so on. So the Me kind of foretells the Me Too movement, but so that's that's part of a series of work that I evolved in the 90s that was very important to me at the time. And the last two are the most recent work, pairing, they're the most direct and in a sense temporary of collage method, since it's simply a photograph clipped from the newspaper laid in onto a picture in an open book. So the series that I've been working on since 2015 has over 100 variations now of works of this sort, and always the date is present in the newspaper. So I called it newspaper diary. I'm making them quite often, and keeping track in a sense of issues that come into the daily press, and juxtaposing them with images such as what you see in the book, famous or parallel in some way also to the current day, but often from much longer ago.
Even including a comparison of illustrations from Little Prince and COVID cures, COVID
yeah,
curve.
so the COVID curve,
right?
The curve that represents well, we don't have that one here, so maybe we shouldn't try.
Oh, it's here.
Oh, it is. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. Oh, the COVID curve. Yes, the COVID curve, yeah. And the Little Prince, the object that nobody can tell what it is unless they're a child with great wisdom, from the Little Prince. So the compare and contrast and the aspect of twinning, which we said we would come back to, is often in my work, in the pairing, like the chandelier and the image in the mirror, that pairs of things are very much, and this is just a very recent funeral photograph from 2021, and one from W. Eugene Smith. So sometimes it's a rehearsing of photo history as well.
Right. And we have sort of a motif that comes through, there's a group of women sort of tending to funerals, right?
Right. And even the pandemic, because this one with Christ and the figure being lowered into a grave is from the Ebola.
Right. And these themes come around and around in your work, but also your work is showing how these events come around and around in history.
Right. Well said. Thank you.
Thank you. That might be a great place to close, Joanne. You've been so generous with your time and with your photographs. We're so thrilled to have such a great selection of your work here, especially since we didn't have any before. And I'm so happy we were able to remedy that. And I think that these photographs will be studied here in classes and by researchers, and I know that I will talk about them to groups who visit, and I couldn't be more thrilled to have them here and to talk with you today, and I'm so glad you could be part of this series and take so much time with us.
Well, I'm honored as well, and you put a lot of effort into learning about the work, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Joanne.